scripture this week is from Matthew's Gospel. It's chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So to give a little bit of context for this passage and where it falls in the gospel, at the beginning of this chapter, chapter 14, Jesus has learned that his cousin, John the Baptist, has been beheaded by Herod. And so Jesus decides that he wants to go out to a deserted place by himself. And the implication is that he needs some time maybe to grieve John's death. He needs some time alone to pray. And maybe actually time to consider and pray about his own fate that he sees coming. But when he gets to this place that is normally deserted, he discovers that people from the surrounding towns have heard that he was headed there. And they anticipated his arrival. And so when he gets there, they are at the shore waiting for him. And the text says that he had compassion for him. And so he spends time with them and he heals their diseases and their illnesses. And after he has done all these healings, with the help of his disciples, he feeds thousands and thousands of people with a few loaves of bread and fish. And that is where the passage for today picks up. So after everybody's been fed, it says that Jesus makes the disciples get into the boat, or in the Greek, forces them to get into the boat. He really wants to be alone. And he sends them ahead of him to the other side of the lake. And he stays behind to dismiss all these people that have come and sought him out. And finally, after all the crowds have left, he gets time alone, and so he goes up the mountain to pray. But while he is up on the mountain praying, the disciples are having a hard time out on the water. And the text says that the boat is being battered. And the word is literally, the boat is being tortured or tormented or harassed by the waves. And I know we've talked about this before, but in the Gospels, actually in all of the biblical writings, water, and especially the sea, these are images with very, very deeply symbolic connotations. And the symbolism goes all the way back to Genesis and the story of the creation. So in that story, God contains and he subdues the chaos of the waters. And so he separates the open waters from the land, and God puts a barrier in the sky. In Genesis, it says a dome. God puts a dome in the sky. And this is because in the ancient world, people believed that above the sky or above this protective dome, there was just more water. It was a big ocean surrounding the earth. And so they saw themselves in the world as being surrounded by this chaos and unpredictability of dangerous waters. And so God holds that dome in place to protect humanity from destruction. And so oceans, bodies of water, these were sort of microcosms of that larger chaos that surrounded and threatened the world and humanity. And so the disciples are now out on that water, and they are being battered by the waves. And in the morning, or in the first watch, or sometime between 3 and 6 a.m., they see this figure approaching them, walking across the water. And of course, they're terrified. They think it's a ghost, which also makes sense because in that time, spirits and ghosts were believed to congregate around bodies of water. But immediately, Jesus calls out to them and he says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And the translation here obscures the real meaning of Jesus's words. Literally, he says, "Take heart, I am." I am. Those are the words that Yahweh speaks to Moses to identify himself. And I am is actually the root word of the name Yahweh. And so now Jesus is using those same words to identify himself to the disciples as he walks across these chaotic and dangerous waters, the very waters that God subdued at the creation of the world. So that's the first observation I want to make about this passage. Jesus identifying himself with God the Creator, the I am. He speaks the words to them, and then he exhibits his authority over creation and over chaos, which would have been quite a claim. Blasphemy. In the book of Job says, "Who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea?" And he also says, "Have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep?" So Jesus is sending a pretty powerful, incredible message here with his words, but also with his actions, walking on that water. The second observation about this passage has to do with Peter's reaction. When Peter hears Jesus's voice and Jesus's assurance, "I am, do not be afraid," Peter says, "If it is you, command me to walk to you on the water." And Peter's words might remind you of other characters and other situations in the gospel. If it is you, if it is I am, then do this. I don't want to demonize Peter here, literally, but that's the same formulation that Satan uses when he's tempting Jesus. He says, "If you are actually the Son of God, why don't you turn these stones into bread? Or if you are the Son of God, if you are who you say you are, throw yourself down from the temple and have God save you." And we also hear it from Jesus's other adversaries in the Gospels, most poignantly at his crucifixion. If he is the Son of God, why doesn't he save himself? So Peter actually doesn't look very good here in this moment. And it's honestly surprising that Jesus says, "Okay, come." step out on the water. Peter gets out of the boat, he takes a few steps, but he notices the strong winds and he gets scared and he starts to sink. And as I was thinking about this passage this week, one of the images that really stuck with me is of just sort of that image of Jesus reaching out to Peter, grabbing his arm, and lifting him up out of the water. And I kept seeing this moment and really thinking about it as if it was a parent lifting a child out of the water. Maybe it's because it's summer and I'm thinking of swimming lessons or something. But that's what I kept thinking of. Steady, trustworthy, strong hand reaching down to a frightened, immature child. The child who tests the parent, but still, even in the midst of the testing, still gets that steady hand. So that's the second observation, and it's related to the first. So Jesus, who was there at the moment of creation, who has authority over the chaos, who says, I am. This is the one who reaches out and pulls up Peter, the frightened child, the child who tests him, the child who doesn't really understand what's happening, the one of really mixed faith. Peter doesn't have a pure faith. Nobody has a pure faith. But he still gets that steady hand from Jesus. The psalmist writes, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me." And that's this moment with Peter. And that is the moment that Jesus reaches out his hand. And so he pulls Peter up out of the water. They both get into the boat. The wind stops, and the disciples worship Jesus, and they confess. They say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And this is the point of the story. This is the climax. The revelation that Jesus is the Son of God, which is followed by worship from the disciples. And this happens through a miracle that saves them, that rescues them. One last thing that I want to comment on about this story, and that's that, does anybody else think that Peter's request just seems kind of weird and strange? I don't see myself doing that in that moment. There are many, many interpretations of this story, you can imagine. And there are a lot that praise Peter for his initial act of faith. So Peter actually gets out of the boat, steps onto the water. I don't think very many of us would probably get that far. And so some people emphasize this point. We can walk on water, figuratively, metaphorically, literally, who knows what that means. We can walk on water. We just have to keep our eyes on Jesus. Do not be afraid. Keep your focus on Jesus. But I think we can also see Peter's request as overstepping, as a way of testing Jesus when he didn't need to. Peter did not need to walk on the water. Jesus was already coming towards them in the boat. He says, "Do not be afraid," but for some reason, Peter wanted more. He wanted some of that divine power for himself, even if it was only granted to him for a couple moments. But I think what happens in the story actually reveals the profundity of Jesus, right? The I am, and the incarnation of Jesus coming to earth to experience what it means to be human, to come alongside humanity. And so he doesn't grant the disciples this miraculous power of God, right? He did not come to earth. He did not come to them across the waters to give them miraculous powers, powers over and above the chaos of the world. He comes to them across the water and he gets into the boat, which I think is a really powerful metaphor for, for what Jesus does for us in life. The disciples still have to row to the shore. They don't glide across the water, but Jesus is there with them in the boat.